At some point in human history, a person looked down at their own body and decided to cover it. Not because someone told them to, not because there was a law, not because they had seen anyone else do it before. Just a decision. A piece of animal skin, or bark, or woven grass pressed against the body for the first time. And from that single moment, something changed about what it meant to be human. That sounds like it should be a simple story. Cold weather arrived, humans needed warmth. They grabbed something to wrap around themselves. Problem solved. But the actual history of why humans started wearing clothes is far stranger, far more layered, and far more revealing about human psychology than that explanation suggests. Because clothing did not just protect the body. It changed the mind. It changed social structure. It changed how humans saw themselves and each other. And the evidence for all of this is sitting in places you would not expect, in genetics, in archaeology, in evolutionary biology, and in the psychology of shame and identity that still runs through every choice you make when you get dressed in the morning. So let us go back, all the way back, to a time before fabric existed, before needles existed, before the concept of being dressed or undressed meant anything at all. Subscribe to Freud Mind for more. Now let us get into it. The first question researchers had to answer was not why humans started wearing clothes. It was when. And for a long time, this seemed like an impossible question. Clothing does not fossilize. Animal skins rot. Woven plant fibers disintegrate over thousands of years. The physical evidence of early clothing is almost entirely gone, and what survives is fragmentary at best. The oldest preserved garments are only around 5,000 to 6,000 years old, which, in the timeline of human evolution, is extremely recent. Humans have been anatomically modern for roughly 300,000 years. Whatever clothing history exists before those preserved fragments had to be reconstructed from indirect evidence. The most surprising source of that indirect evidence turned out to be lice. Human body lice, the kind that live in clothing rather than in hair, are genetically distinct from head lice. They are adapted specifically to the environment of fabric against skin. And because they are a separate population from head lice, researchers can use genetic analysis to estimate when they diverged, which is approximately when humans started wearing clothes regularly enough to create a stable habitat for a new louse population to evolve. The results of this analysis placed the origin of clothing somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago. Depending on which study you look at, the estimate shifts. But the consistent finding is that clothing emerged somewhere in this range. Deep in the Paleolithic, long before agriculture, long before permanent settlements, in a world where humans were nomadic hunter-gatherers, navigating an environment that was, at various points, dramatically colder than what most of us experience today. That timing matters because it lines up with one of the most significant climate events in recent human prehistory. Around 100,000 to 75,000 years ago, the Earth entered a period of intense glacial cooling. Temperatures dropped significantly. Ice sheets expanded. Large portions of the African continent, where modern humans originated, became cooler and drier. And populations of early humans, some of whom were beginning to migrate out of Africa into colder northern environments, would have faced temperatures that a bare human body simply cannot survive for long. This is the survival argument for clothing, and it is the most intuitive one. The human body lost most of its fur covering somewhere between 3 and 4 million years ago, a change that researchers linked to the shift toward upright walking and the need to thermoregulate during long-distance travel in open savanna environments. Less body hair meant better heat dissipation when running or walking in warm conditions, but it also meant vulnerability to cold. The same adaptation that made humans efficient long-distance travelers in warm climates made them fragile in cold ones. Clothing solved this problem in a way that biology could not keep up with. Instead of waiting hundreds of thousands of years for natural selection to produce a hairier human, which it was not going to do, because the overall direction of human evolution favored intelligence and tool use over biological adaptation. Early humans used the intelligence they already had to create an external solution. They took the fur from other animals and wore it themselves. It was one of the earliest and most consequential examples of humans using technology to override the limitations of their biology. But here is where the story gets more complicated. Because the lice evidence places the origin of clothing during a cold period, but it does not tell us that cold weather was the only reason. And when researchers look at the archaeological evidence for early clothing tools, bone needles, hide-scraping implements, the remains of prepared animal skins, something interesting emerges. The oldest bone needles found so far date to around 50,000 years ago, found in Siberia at a site associated with a population called the Denisovans, a group of archaic humans who were distinct from both modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. But evidence of hide preparation, the process of scraping and softening animal skins to make them wearable, goes back much further, to sites across Africa and Europe associated with both Neanderthals and early modern humans. Neanderthals, who lived in Europe and Western Asia during cold, glacial periods, show clear evidence of processing animal hides. They used specific stone tools, scrapers, to remove fat and tissue from skins. Some sites show patterns of cut marks on animal bones, consistent with careful skinning rather than just butchering for meat. They were making clothing. Not the stitched, tailored clothing that came later, but wrapped and tied skins that covered the body. What this means is that the behavior of covering the body was not unique to modern Homo sapiens. It emerged independently, or was shared across, multiple human and human-adjacent populations facing cold environments. The drive to cover the body, initially at least, appears to have been a practical response to a physical problem, widespread across different groups of humans facing similar challenges. But then something shifts. And this is the part that separates clothing as survival tool from clothing as something far more culturally loaded. At some point, and the timing is hard to pin down precisely, but it appears to accelerate in the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Clothing stops being purely functional and starts being decorative. Beads appear on garments. Ochre pigments are applied to skins. Specific animals are chosen not just for the warmth of their fur, but apparently for the significance of the animal itself. Predator skins, rare animals, animals with symbolic meaning in the culture. This shift is enormous. It means that clothing had crossed a threshold from technology to language. What you wore was now saying something about who you were, what you had done, what group you belonged to, what status you held. A person wearing the skin of a large predator was communicating something to every other person who saw them. And that communication required an audience. It only worked because other people could read it. This is the social origin of clothing, and in some ways, it is more consequential than the thermal one. Because once clothing became a form of communication, it created an entirely new dimension of human social life. The question was no longer just, am I warm enough? It was, what am I saying? And what are others saying about me? And that question has never gone away. The psychology of this is worth dwelling on. The moment clothing became a social signal, the body underneath it became something different too. It became private, hidden, separated from the social world by a layer of chosen presentation. And with that separation came something that appears to be genuinely unique to humans: the experience of modesty. No other animal experiences modesty in the way humans do. Other animals do not have a concept of their bodies as things that should be covered or hidden. They do not feel shame about their physical form. The experience of the body as something that can be exposed or concealed, appropriate or inappropriate, is entirely constructed by the human mind in a social context. And clothing is both the cause and the product of that construction. The relationship between clothing and shame is documented in almost every human culture on Earth, and it cuts across geography and history in ways that suggest it is not just a local cultural habit, but something that emerged wherever humans developed clothing as a social system. The body covered became the body that needed covering. The act of concealment created the concept of what was being concealed. There is a paradox here that researchers in evolutionary psychology find genuinely interesting. Clothing likely preceded modesty rather than resulting from it. Humans did not start wearing clothes because they were ashamed of their bodies. They started wearing clothes because they were cold, and because clothing became a status signal. But once clothing was established as a norm, the uncovered body became marked, deviant, requiring explanation. And from that inversion came the psychology of modesty, a sense that the unclothed state is vulnerable, exposed, in need of protection. This also connects to something broader about human identity that clothing taps into in a way no other technology quite does. What you wear is one of the primary ways humans communicate who they are to the social world. The psychology of clothing and identity has been studied extensively in the last few decades, and the findings are consistently interesting. People make judgments about strangers within seconds of seeing them, and clothing is one of the primary data sources for those judgments. Those judgments are often wrong in specific ways. They reflect cultural assumptions about what certain clothing signals, but they are made automatically, below the level of deliberate thought, using the same social cognition systems that humans have been running since the Paleolithic. More interesting is what clothing does to the person wearing it, not just to the people observing them. A concept researchers call enclothed cognition describes the finding that the clothes you wear actually influence your own psychological state and cognitive performance. Studies have found that wearing a lab coat, when you believe it belongs to a doctor, increases attention and careful thinking compared to wearing the same coat believing it belongs to a painter. The physical experience of the garment combines with its symbolic meaning to produce real changes in how the brain operates. This is not a trivial finding. It means that the social meaning humans assigned to clothing tens of thousands of years ago, the idea that what you wear says something about who you are, has been so deeply integrated into human cognition that it now actually shapes how you think and behave. The symbol has become functional. The cultural construction has become psychological reality. There is also the question of what clothing did to human sexuality and social behavior, which is impossible to ignore in any honest account of why clothing matters. The concealment of the body created a specific kind of attention that does not exist in species without clothing norms. When the body is always visible, there is no particular significance to visibility. When the body is normally covered, exposure becomes charged with meaning. Human sexuality is shaped by clothing norms in ways that are deeply cultural, but also deeply psychological. The covered body creates a category of the revealed body that would not exist without the covering. Researchers in evolutionary psychology have noted that this dynamic is unlike anything seen in other species, and that it likely had significant effects on human social organization. Privacy became possible. The management of sexual attention became something that could be negotiated through clothing choices. Social contexts, formal, informal, intimate, could be differentiated by what was worn in them. All of this complexity layered onto human social life directly as a result of the norms around clothing. Different cultures resolved these questions in radically different ways. What counts as appropriate covering, which parts of the body carry social significance, what exposure means in different contexts, these vary enormously across human societies. But the underlying dynamic, that clothing creates the category of the covered body that requires social management, appears wherever clothing norms exist. The specific rules differ. The existence of rules does not. The development of textile production, the shift from using animal skins to actually making fabric from plant or animal fibers, represents another enormous leap, and one that is much more recent than the origin of clothing itself. The earliest evidence of fiber processing dates to around 30,000 years ago, where researchers have found flax fibers at a site in Georgia that appear to have been twisted into cordage or simple textiles. Actual woven fabric begins appearing in the archaeological record around 25,000 to 27,000 years ago, with the oldest confirmed woven textile fragments dating to around that period. The invention of weaving changed clothing dramatically. Animal skins are limited by the size and shape of the animal. Woven fabric can be produced in any quantity, shaped to fit, layered, colored, and decorated with a precision and variety that skins cannot match. And crucially, fabric production can be scaled. One person can produce far more fabric than they personally need. Surplus fabric becomes tradable. Clothing becomes an economic object as well as a social one. This economic dimension of clothing opened up entirely new forms of social differentiation. The quality of your clothing, the fineness of the weave, the rarity of the dye, the complexity of the construction, became a legible marker of wealth and access in a way that was very difficult to fake. For most of human history, fine cloth was extraordinarily labor-intensive to produce. The social hierarchy embedded in clothing quality was not arbitrary. It reflected genuine differences in the resources required to produce different types of garments. This is why, across virtually every complex human society that developed after the invention of weaving, clothing regulation became a feature of social organization. Sumptuary laws, laws governing who was allowed to wear what, appear in ancient Rome, medieval Europe, feudal Japan, Imperial China, and many other societies independently. The fact that this type of regulation emerged so consistently across unconnected cultures suggests that the social signaling power of clothing was so significant that ruling classes repeatedly felt the need to legally protect their exclusive access to it. What you wore was too powerful a social signal to leave unregulated. Which brings us back to the present, and to what all of this ancient history means for the choices you make every morning when you get dressed. The decisions feel personal, aesthetic, individual. And in some ways, they are. But they are also running on cognitive and social machinery that is very old. The impulse to signal group membership through clothing, the reason you can often identify someone's subculture, profession, political leaning, or social class from what they wear, is the same impulse that drove Upper Paleolithic humans to wear specific animal skins. The experience of putting on certain clothes and feeling more capable, more confident, more like a particular version of yourself. That is, enclothed cognition operating in real time, built on tens of thousands of years of humans tying identity to what they wore. The discomfort of being underdressed or overdressed for a social context, that is the modesty system running, the ancient social monitoring function that tracks how your presentation maps onto group norms. None of this is fully conscious. It happens below the level of deliberate thought, in the same fast social cognition systems that evolved to manage human group life. You are not just picking an outfit. You are operating a social technology that your species has been developing and refining for somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years. That first person who pressed an animal skin against their body for warmth, they could not have imagined fashion weeks, dress codes, school uniforms, wedding dresses, or the specific anxiety of deciding what to wear to a job interview. But they started something. A chain of cultural and psychological development that turned a practical response to cold weather into one of the most complex and meaning-laden systems in human social life. The body got covered, and nothing about how humans saw themselves or each other was ever quite the same again. Subscribe to Freud Mind for more videos like these.